You probably know about the Indian Revolt of 1857, also called the Indian Mutiny. But here's what most people don't know. The majority of British troops that saved the Empire were not actually from the regular British Army at all. They were British soldiers serving in the East India Company's own European regiments, long-serving units that most people have forgotten even existed. And what even fewer people realise is that these troops also staged their own mutiny shortly afterwards, and it had nothing to do with striking a blow for Indian independence. It was something far more embarrassing for the British government. These European soldiers, British and Irish men who had just fought to put down the Indian Sepoy Revolt, earning a dozen Victoria Crosses in the process, were refusing to transfer from the East India Company Army to the regular British Army. The scale was staggering. Given a choice of transferring or being discharged, over 7,000 chose to leave. This is the story of the White Indian Mutiny, when Britain's own heroes rebelled and the British government quietly swept it under the carpet. To understand why this happened, we need to go back to 1857, to the darkest hour in the history of British India. The Indian Mutiny had nearly brought British rule in the subcontinent to its knees. Sepoy regiments across northern India had risen in rebellion, proclaiming the aged Mughal emperor in Delhi and threatening to drive the British into the sea. British control hung by a thread. Reinforcements were months away, and the outcome was far from certain. Here's the surprising truth about the British military in India in 1857. There were only around 35,000 British, in other words white, soldiers scattered across the vast Indian subcontinent when the Sepoy Revolt broke out. The regular British Army contingent was relatively small, perhaps only 10 to 15,000 of those 35,000. The majority of British forces available were actually the East India Company Europeans, making these company regiments absolutely critical to British survival. These company regiments weren't newly raised units thrown together in the crisis. They were long-established units that had provided the backbone to British expansion in the subcontinent. For instance, the 1st Bengal European Regiment had served since 1652, Oliver Cromwell's time, and were older than most British regular regiments. The Madras Europeans dated to 1742, just before Robert Clive had appeared on the scene. The 1st Bengals, who I mentioned just now, would fight for Clive at the Battle of Plassey, and also at the critical Battle of Buxor. By 1857, 10 European infantry and 4 cavalry regiments formed the crucial backbone of the company's forces, accounting for about 15% of the East India Company Army. Many of their men came from families with a long record of service with the regiments. Others were well into their 30s, with over a decade of experience of army life in India. Their numbers and experience would prove to be the difference between defeat and victory for the British during the forthcoming Great Indian Revolt. When the Indian Mutiny erupted, these regiments proved their worth once again. While native sepoy regiments in Bengal mutinied, the European regiments stayed loyal and fought in every decisive engagement that saved the empire. At least 12 men from these European regiments were awarded the Victoria Cross during the revolt, including Major Charles Gough of the 5th Bengal European Cavalry, who won his VC for 4 separate acts of gallantry during the mutiny, including saving his own brother's life. That brother, by the way, Hugh Gough, would also be awarded the VC, and as an interesting aside, Charles's son, John Gough, would receive Britain's highest medal for valour as well, making them the only family to be awarded 3 Victoria Crosses. 5 men from the 1st Bengal European Fusiliers were awarded the VC following the storming of Delhi. And also during that battle, a further Victoria Cross was awarded to Lieutenant Thomas Cadell of the 2nd Bengal Europeans. Meanwhile, 4 Victoria Crosses were awarded to men of the 1st Madras European Fusiliers during the siege and relief of Lucknow. All of these particular men were in their 30s, which tends to show the long service that men of the European regiments were committed to. But they weren't all veterans. 26-year-old Francis Whirlpool from Dundalk in Ireland had travelled to India following an argument with his father. There, he joined the 3rd Bombay European Regiment and found himself in action at the capture of Jhansi. Here, he ran across open ground to rescue 2 wounded soldiers, and later on single-handedly defended an injured officer while surrounded by the enemy. And during that stand, he was injured 17 times, including one wound that nearly severed his head from his body. But here's where the story gets absolutely incredible. These same men who held the ridge at Delhi during the months-long siege, who helped retake Cawnpore after the horrific massacre, who fought through the multiple relief operations to break the siege at Lucknow, these empire savers were about to become empire rejectors less than a year later. On August 2nd, 1858, Parliament in London passed the Government of India Act, transferring British power over India from the East India Company to the Crown. That transfer would also include the company's army, whose European regiments would become part of the regular British Army. In theory, it should have been a smooth transfer. Certainly, the Viceroy, Lord Canning, thought so when he addressed a Grand Durbar or meeting at Allahabad on the 1st of November 1858. There, in front of assembled Indian and British dignitaries, he read Queen Victoria's proclamation announcing the transfer. From now on, he read, Queen Victoria's subjects in India would be governed and treated just like her subjects back in Britain. Many Indians beg to differ as to whether that lofty ideal ever materialised, or indeed if it was anything more than words to sound good. And somewhere in this proclamation, he turned to the European troops present and gave them the good news that they were now part of the British Army. But there's one slight problem. Canning had jumped the gun. The exact terms of the transfer were still being debated by a royal commission back in London, which had failed to consult the company troops. His announcement was a bolt out of the blue, and apart from the shock, left a lot of questions unanswered for the European troops about to be transferred. Because, whilst to Canning it looked like a seamless merger, the reality was that the pay and conditions between the two armies were very different. Unlike regular British Army regiments who served in India as a tour of duty, company troops received bata, an extra allowance to pay to cover the higher cost of living and service in areas outside their home territories. Yet this transfer to the British regular army meant that soldiers in the European regiments were going to basically get a drop in wages. And this disquiet was not just being felt in the ranks. Officers were concerned that, as in terms of precedence, British Army officers were senior to company officers of the same rank. They were effectively going to be demoted, or at least at the very back of the queue for any future promotions. But perhaps most importantly, it wasn't just the concerns around pay and promotion. It was emotional too. They were not British Army soldiers. They were company soldiers. They came from regiments with long and proud histories, traditions and cultures, which were going to be watered down by the regular British Army. And anyone who's gone through a company merger might sympathise with them. Can you imagine historic regiments with 100 or even 200 years of traditions being told that their identity basically no longer mattered? The very men who had just saved the empire at Delhi and Cawnpore and Lucknow and Jhansi, and whose efforts had been recognised with a dozen Victoria Crosses, were being informed that their terms of service would be dictated to them without consultation, without negotiation. The response was swift and unprecedented. 10,000 men from the European regiments of the East India Company mutinied. The mutiny took many different forms. Soldiers of the 1st Bengal European Light Cavalry performed only guard and barrack duties, and refused to turn out for parade. Contemporary reports noted that mutinous language was used. At some installations, there were incidents of physical violence both on the part of men and even the officers of the European regiments. The 5th Bengal European Light Cavalry, Major Gough VC's old regiment, he by the way had now moved on, became amongst the most outspoken critics during this White Mutiny. They chose the ultimate form of protest, choosing to dissolve themselves rather than serve new terms. The British authorities were taken aback and were worried. Not only were they now, having just put down the Sepoy Revolt, facing unrest from another quarter, but exactly who were they going to use to bring these Europeans back into line? I mean, the idea of using sepoys who'd remained loyal in the recent revolt, Sikhs, Gurkhas, and the men from the Madras and Bombay Presidency armies, was fraught with all the wrong connotations as far as re-establishing British rule in India was concerned. The alternative was to use regular British troops to potentially fire on fellow whites who'd recently been fighting alongside them. It was not impossible to envisage a situation where the regulars might refuse to obey those orders, and then where would we be? And there was a further worry. If this mutiny wasn't dealt with rapidly before it got out of control, it could inspire Indians to reignite their own revolt. Faced with these scenarios, the government capitulated. The members of the European regiments were offered two choices. They could either transfer as proposed, or they would be given free and clear release with free passage home. This was essentially an honourable discharge, with no penalties despite the mutinous behaviour. No court-martials, no punishment. The men were presented with the options. 7,200 chose to take the free passage home. Over 25% or a quarter of the total strength of the European regiments back in 1857. It was and it remains unprecedented. So what happened to those regiments that did transfer? Well, 9 European regiments became the 101st through to the 109th regiments of foot in the British Army order of precedence. The cavalry regiments became the 19th, 20th and 21st Hussars. In the 1881 British Army reforms, many of these were amalgamated into what became famous Irish regiments. The 101st and 104th regiments became the Royal Munster Fusiliers. The 102nd and 103rd became the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. The White Indian Mutiny remains one of the most forgotten episodes in British military history. And yet, by any measure, this was extraordinary. Over 10,000 European soldiers in British service were involved, making it the largest mutiny by white troops in the history of the British Empire. Men who had just spent 2 years saving the British Empire in its darkest hour. Men who had held the Ridge at Delhi, who'd fought through the siege of Lucknow, who'd earned Victoria Crosses for extraordinary gallantry. And whilst the numbers of European regiment casualties are hard to ascertain in the Indian Mutiny, what is certain is that 2 of the 12 men awarded the VC were killed in action later during the 1857 revolt. Sergeant Patrick Mahoney and Private John Ryan, both from the 1st Madras Fusiliers. The White Mutiny was bloodless, but for the British government it was an embarrassment. It represented a catastrophic failure of leadership, diplomacy, and an enormous waste of military experience and expertise. Perhaps that's why this story was quietly forgotten. After all, it's a lot easier to celebrate the victories at Lucknow and Delhi than explain why the men who won those battles chose to abandon their careers rather than serve the British Crown. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story about a largely forgotten chapter from the British Raj in India. Why not check out my story about another one of those European regiment VC holders, James Maguire of the 1st Bengals, who was later controversially stripped of his award. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.